Good morning. I am glad to be here with you this morning at Insight. I am here virtually right now, but actually that's only because I am leading worship right now out in our parking lot. As soon as that is done, I will hopefully be springboarding into the end of this and able to have some conversation with you all. But I'm glad you're here. We are going to be talking about this morning where First Pres is headed. Last week we got an absolutely spectacular presentation by Mark Hunter about the history of First Presbyterian Church and where we have been in the community. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about where we maybe are heading as a church and some of the broader questions of, what kinds of things are people seeing in the church right now, more broadly than even just First Presbyterian. Before I begin to talk about the future, however, I am going to make some quick mention of the past. Not our particular past, but the past of the church in general. So years ago, I think it would have been maybe 2008, 2009, I read this wonderful book and got introduced to the work of Phyllis Tickle. And Phyllis, I had the opportunity to meet her. She's a delightful woman, and she looked at church history and kind of the social, cultural milieu around the church. And she became rather famous for talking about the church's 500-year garage sale. That she posited basically that every 500 years or so, the cultural and social settings around the church have changed so much that the church ends up having a big, huge yard sale and pulls everything out onto the driveway and picks through it and says, this is something that we need to keep. This is something that we need to throw away. And then generally, like sometimes happens when we have a garage sale, we say, oh, now that I've got more room, I'm gonna add this new thing to the mix. And then the church reconstructs itself somewhat, and then goes on its merry little way for the next 500 or so years. And so anyway, so she introduces this idea, and so she says, like the first yard sale, as it were, actually is Jesus, who starts picking through all of the pieces of his Jewish heritage and says, here are things that we should keep. Here are things that need to be challenged. And guess what? I've got a whole bunch of new bits and pieces that I'm going to add in. So she calls that the Great Transformation. Then about 500 years later, you see the social cultural context of the church changes. You have the collapse of the Roman Empire, which up until that time had really been part and parcel of the Christian tradition, had become part and parcel quite deeply. So you have 500, at around 500, you have the collapse of the Roman Empire, then and the fall into the Dark Ages. And you see a big, huge shift in the church in that moment with the real rise of the strength of monasticism and the monastic movement. And you have the church turns towards the activities of preservation of themselves and of culture, and of that's when you think of the monks and the nuns doing the beautiful illuminations and the careful copying of texts and sacred texts, and so you have the rise of monasticism. So that's around 500, around 1,000. 1,054, you have, and there goes the air conditioning, trying to get everything cooled off here in the church. You have the rise of, the Great Schism, the split between the Eastern and the Western churches, which now we have the Eastern Orthodox branch and the Roman Catholic branch. A variety of reasons for that, but so the Great Schism happens at 1,000. And then what happens around 1,500? That's the Reformation that we know and love as Protestants and Presbyterians. You have, and again, that there's some changes, most especially the printing press is key, a new way, a new technology that allows Scripture to be accessible, to be translated, to be distributed. So all of those things challenge some of the ways in which the church had been operating for years, and made people more aware of some of the, the assumptions that this is just, you must be in the Bible somewhere, and then, oh wait, no, it's not. So you have the Reformation. So then 1,500, she would say about 2,000, here we are right in the smack middle of another church garage sale. Another church garage sale. And again, so even though 1054 has a particular date set to it, these are not things that happen instantaneously. There is both, it's more of a bell curve. So there's pressures on the church, there's changes, you might see some new forms of being church, starting to emerge, and it slowly ramps up to a sort of a tipping point, at which point in time there's the garage sale happens, and then there's a time period where the church then is trying to knit itself back together again, trying to figure out what forms it will take, what will be important to it, what its purpose in the world is, and then there'll be hundreds of years of stability, and then kind of upheaval again. Again, we're sort of in this upheaval, and that sort of resonates with me. When I think back to some of the statistics and things that have come out of as of late. So I celebrated the 25th year of my ordination. Last July was my ordiversary. And so in the 25 years that I've been a pastor, which to me doesn't seem, it's my lifetime, it doesn't seem like it's that long at all. When I started seminary and graduated, 70% of the United States had some sort of denominational affiliation. When they'd fill out, oh yes, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Presbyterian, I'm a Lutheran, I'm a non-denominational, they would have some affiliation with some type of Christian community. Now, for the first time ever, that's fallen below 50%. It's fallen below 50%. So 47% just, I think it was in 2020. So that might be numbers from 2019. But 47% now have some kind of denominational affiliation. A lot of others say, well, I'm Christian, but I don't really connect with any church at all. Or I have an interest in spirituality, but I'm not connecting with any particular church at all. I don't have a particular denominational mindset. I'm not going into a town and looking for a Presbyterian church. In fact, I might not even look for any church at all. but I have a Bible and I read it from time to time, or I believe in some way as I head out and go on a hike outside. I feel a connection with my Creator, but I'm not going to church on Sunday. I'm not participating in the life of a congregation. So anyway, that's been a huge shift. Another big shift that some recent Barna research has come out is it used to be, again, when I was growing up, that a regular attender meant that you were there pretty much every Sunday. If you were sick, okay, yeah. Maybe you had a little bit of travel from time to time, but you were there almost every Sunday. Almost every Sunday. Now, a regular attender is considered someone who attends twice someone who attends twice a month. That's regular. Irregular attendance or connection might be, once a quarter, Christmas and Easter, those kinds of things, or just at particular transitions, weddings and baptisms and confirmation, funerals. So those kinds of connections, those kind of high points of life connections, but not a lot of other connection. The other thing is there is, I would say there is just a wee bit more diversity in our churches. I think in terms of, and maybe not, and I think we're way behind our general society in that we are pretty siloed still on a Sunday morning. But we're less so than perhaps that we used to be, in that there is a little bit more of diversity in economic and racial and cultural and well, it depends, political sometimes, norms. So there's a little bit more diversity in that. Again, I remember, growing up, and oh gosh, we were all dressed alike, and there was a certain dress code, and you had a certain look about you, and you acted in exactly the same way. And I think there's generally a broader acceptance of some broader differences. So anyway, so those are some of the things that I've noticed. I'm going to put a little pin in here, and Matt, if you'd like to, you could put a pause and ask people who are here in the Zoom meeting what kinds of differences that they have seen or experienced in our current time than what they remember growing up. Okay, so we're back again. Maybe we've had some good conversation. Maybe you guys have been very quiet. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of, I guess, some of the things that are cultural pressures on the church. For one thing, our science has progressed, and our scientific understanding has progressed exponentially from the times in which some of our doctrine and our practices were created. And so that's one very, very large piece. I think our church really does a very good job of looking at new and emerging scientific understandings and trying to incorporate them and see and have meaningful conversation between the faith understandings and scientific learnings. I think we do a very good job of that here. That's not something that happens across the board in some churches. So that would maybe be a place of greater pressure in other and other denominational places. So again, I mentioned sort of that cultural diversity. More and more, we are seeing a greater and greater cultural diversity around us. In terms of, I think there are a variety of communities, even here in Iowa, where it isn't necessarily a white majority anymore. That it's definitely more of a mix with greater percentages of African American, African, Hispanic groups that have moved in and are part of a very diverse community makeup. We're maybe, again, we're Iowa, we're a little bit behind the curve on that in some areas, but even in Iowa, we are seeing a greater and greater diversity within our own community, within Cedar Rapids. So that is definitely something that the church can take into account. Also, people are living longer, and that is also affecting the ways in which the patterns of life events. So for example, it used to be that sort of your pattern for how one's life would unfold is you'd go through high school, and then at the graduation of high school, maybe you'd go to college, maybe you wouldn't, but relatively early in your late teens, early 20s, you were settling down and starting a family. Maybe it was, right after, getting married right out of college. Sometimes it's getting married right out of high school. And then started having a family immediately. Nowadays, I think the average age of marriage has gone up to 26 or 27. Which means there's a much greater span of those early 20s that instead of being focused on marriage and the issues of marriage are focused on different issues of job procurement, starting careers, determining, bonding with your friendships group, doing travel, which is much more accessible. Those kinds of things. And then the potential for settling down and having children comes later. And for an increasing number of young people that actually doesn't happen. There's more and more, and they're seeing it even more with the generation behind the millennials. They're choosing to not have children, or not as many children, or to not have children, because there is such a concern about the environment. So living, and then again, also then on the other side of things, retiring in 60s, sometimes choosing to go a little bit longer than that. But then having years with the potential for good health and engagement. So how do those things fit in? It used to be, and actually in some ways, our churches still to this day make some assumptions about, well, we have a really good high school youth group, and then our young people graduate, and maybe they sow their wild oats and they don't attend church when they're in college, and they're in and out, but we kind of keep a little bit connected with them because we know, and this is the assumption that have been making as church, we know that they'll get married, and once they have a baby, they'll want it baptized, and then they'll come back to the church. Well, it used to be that was like, 2, 3, 4 years. Now it's like a decade. And a decade's a long time to think about coming back. Some do, some don't. But that being our game plan and having nothing to engage with or address the issues, the life issues of young adults in their 20s that aren't raising families. I mean, that's a huge gap that I think we have in churches. And then on the other end of things, I think there are some, assumptions that, not enough attention paid to the gifts and the abilities that our older members and older generations have to give to the life of the church. And sometimes you'll have people who will say like, hey, I taught Sunday school for 25 years, I am done. But instead being able to engage and say, okay, well, what other things are out there for you? What else would help you continue to grow in your faith, and not consider like, oh, well, you're too old to do anything other than be visited by somebody who's younger, right? Right. So recognizing and understanding the deep gifts we have as people are living longer and healthier and very productive lives in their 60s, their 70s, their 80s. So being attentive to that, that's a huge shift for us too. The shifts in travel and relocation. Again, it used to be a model that you would start up with a company, and you might work with that company the entirety of your life, if you were lucky. I mean, that was your goal. You might switch jobs, you might have to switch companies, somebody downsizes or whatever, but that was not the ideal. I think, it's the standard now that a young person entering the job market will probably work at 7 to 10 different jobs, often over multiple companies, throughout the lifespan of their career now. Along an attendant with that becomes then the increased mobility. I'm an anomaly. I've lived in Cedar Rapids most of my life, and that is now an anomaly. The assumption is, and I look at my younger cousins who, they live out west, they live down, moved to Texas for a new job, or, are now looking for something else. They might be complete, so there's there's more of a fluidity to our society. Where does that come into play for churches? Oh, I was going to get to that later. Well, anyway, I'm going to keep on the changes, and then we'll come back and talk about how that might impact First Presbyterian in a minute. Changing family structures. The assumption that families come in all shapes and sizes, that it's no longer mom, dad, and either at one point in time, mom, dad, and a past 6, 7 kids, or mom, dad, or the nuclear family, mom, dad, and 2.5 or kids, or whatever the average was. That's decreasing. That there are a lot of single parent families. There are a lot of blended families. Families that are blended, families that are sharing custody of kids, you might have grandparents raising kids. You have all sorts of different formats, as well as the fact that more often than not now, you also have in two-parent households, each parent has a job. That's more. That's just the way it is for most people. That they need to have, economically, sometimes they need to have both, and also just for the reality that Women like to have careers too, and to do things outside of the household, and find fulfillment in that way. And so that causes a whole bunch of shifts in how families are operated, and who's responsible for what, and what kind of extra free time families have to engage in church programming, and trying to attend to the spiritual life of their children. So those are all cultural issues that are brought to bear. Is it any wonder that the church is kind of in a time of turmoil and upheaval and reinventing itself? I mean, I've been through 6 of them now, I think, 6 changes, and I haven't even gotten to the biggest one, the printing press of our day and age. And yes, I am talking about the rise of computers, the internet, the ability to have the world in my pocket, to be able to do things like giving a presentation to you right now, for you all to have conversation with one another, and for me to be able to hop into that conversation. You know, I wouldn't have imagined 5 years ago. I wouldn't have even thought of, oh, this is something we need to do, because it wasn't even on my brain that we could do it. It wasn't even part of my knowledge base that we could do something like this. And maybe at that point in time we couldn't have really. But all of that being at our fingertips, the fact, again, that you have people who are disassociating with particular denominational religions but are spiritually curious, and oftentimes are looking on here way before they would go into a church building at all, or attend a worship service at all in person. They are trying to find and meet their spiritual needs through electronic means. That again, that's huge. That's printing press huge for what that does in a variety of different ways. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit. So we've talked about the garage sale, and we've talked about some of the sea in which the boat of the church is floating right now, and it's pretty turbulent sea right now. So what are some of the characteristics of the new emerging churches that are bubbling up? And again, so this has been happening for a while, and but I think it's been gaining sort of head of steam, and I think the pandemic, at least in our country, has just caused a huge leapfrog forward into this new reality. It really has. So a few of the things that we have seen is these new emerging forms of church are oftentimes based on practice. Practice that is integrated into one's life. And that they're actions that are tied to belief. Now, what does that look like? Let me give you some examples of some new and emerging forms of church. There are things such as house churches. And those house churches, they're sort of what they are. House churches which meet. They're a small group of people that maybe meet for a Bible study, meet for some action together, sing some songs. We had a couple of little house churches that were meeting in Cedar Rapids that I know of. Sometimes they grow into something else, and sometimes they sort of morph and die out. Another emergent form of church is dinner church. That's actually become very popular in that people once a week gather around, at the heart of their gathering is a meal that has a liturgy around it. There's an attendance to scripture. There might be a little bit of a presentation by a pastor or a spiritual leader, but a lot of it is then based on discussion. So sort of like a reading of scripture at the beginning of the meal, and then a few thoughts on it, and then some questions to start conversation going around the table. Again, but incorporating some singing, some prayers, some praying, service through cleaning up and that kind of thing. A conversation around what this community wants to do, oftentimes in that neighborhood, to help transform that neighborhood. So that would be like, you can look at St. Lydia's in New York is kind of the gold standard example of that, but they're all over the place now. So dinner churches, I have a friend who runs a farm church. It was started a community of people, again, so shared practice together. It was formed by a community of people in North Carolina. Oh gosh, and I'm blanking on the community. Durham, I think. Anyway, in a relatively, impoverished part of the city, wherein they purchased some land, some empty lots, and they worship together in a very casual sort of way. And usually, as part of the morning, there is some work in the garden or in the garden area in this urban farm. And then now they serve produce to the neighborhood and engage with the neighborhood. They're working on kind of transforming that area within Durham. And again, it's this new worshiping community that is based out of practice. Now, these worshiping communities are often smaller. They are not the First Pres 400 members. They're, a gathering might be 25, 30 with, 50 to 75 in that would consider themselves part of the community. There's usually less attention paid to membership. Like, oh, you're a member now and you weren't a member before. It's sort of like, if you show up and you help out in the garden, well, you're part of us now, kind of thing. It's driving the new worshiping communities that are Presbyterian that are doing this are driving the national church nuts, because they don't know how to account for them and what they're doing, because we're so numbers based in the Presbyterian church. So anyway, they're smaller. Usually the leadership is very shared. Sometimes, usually they're either led by pastors who are also what we call tent makers. That just means that this is not their only job. So I might be a school teacher and a pastor, and so because of that, I'm doing some of the organizing of the community, but I am sharing that leadership throughout the community, and the community folds if it's not that way, because the pastor is only maybe spending 15 hours a week or 20 hours a week, very, very, more of a part-time. So I might be, working at, actually, so I had another friend who was doing that, and he worked at REI and pastored a very small little church. So that's the tent maker model. Also, there's an uptick in people who maybe are considered more laity. And again, that division is blurrier and blurrier. Again, in the Presbyterian church, to be called a pastor, you have to have gone through a certain process, and You have had to have gone to seminary and done a certain course of study and gone through the process and done things like clinical pastoral education and all of that. Well, there's a lot that are being led by what we're now calling commissioned ruling elders, which is an elder who has a heart for study and for leadership, and so maybe is taking on the leadership of one of these small communities and being supported by the denomination and having some theological background, but not necessarily the whole process that a called and installed pastor. That's within Presbyterian circles. Other denominations, each one is doing it very, very differently, but there's definitely this move towards either tent-making pastors or shared leadership. This will become especially more important, and seminaries are having to reinvent themselves in the Presbyterian Church because their enrollments have dropped so much. And I think we're getting close. There's kind of a cliff of retirement that what was it? There was probably a couple, 2-3 years ago, there was something that came out that said it was like 70% of Presbyterian clergy were within 5 years of retirement, and our retirement's 68. We're full for full, I believe, 67 for full. Anyway, so we're within 5 years. So, and that seminaries were not even being able to make full classes because so few people were saying, you know what, the church is changing so much, I can't take on that kind of debt and that kind of time to do that kind of preparation when I'm most likely going to be leading a very different kind of community where I'm not going to get paid very much at all, and I will spend the rest of my life in debt. Anyway, there's a lot around that. We'll see how that all plays out in terms of our clergy in the Presbyterian Church again. Because there's less ordained clergy, at least in Presbyterian circles, these communities rely heavily upon the gifts and skills of their membership. And the denomination recognize gifts and skills in the membership. So the membership chooses what kinds of ministries it's going to be involved in. It might not look exactly like we have this kind of Sunday school and this kind of vacation Bible school, and this is what our adult education program looks like, and instead it's saying, what do we need as a community of faith to grow, and what gifts do we have to make that happen, and what does that realistically look like going forward? Instead of, again, having these set ideas of what programming looks like, often that are coming out of the 50s and 60s, they're saying no, we can't do that. That's not life-giving for us. We're only going to do those things that help us grow in faith and are life-giving for our community. Anyway, so our denomination has really recognized this trend and has created what's called 1001 new worshiping communities. So this idea that we're trying to develop and begin 1001 of these communities that worship together and serve together, but in very different ways than traditional church structures. Okay, one last little bit now. So let's now move that into First Presbyterian Church. And where are we heading? What is our future? So we, I think, are really at an interesting place as a community of faith. One of the, again, now I'm going to return back to Phyllis Tickle. And because one of the things that she points out is that never does the old way of doing church completely disappear. So for example, in the Reformation, the Catholic Church did not just disappear with the advent of these newer forms, right? But what did happen is the Catholic Church ended up going through its own Reformation and its own decision to look at how it was doing things. And it's probably due to do that again too, along with all of us Protestants. So I would place First Presbyterian, so one of the things that Phyllis suggests, or suggested back in 2010, and I wouldn't say that she's wrong in this, is that that there is going to be sort of a collapse of a lot of the regular forms of church as we've thought of them. And we're seeing this already in Cedar Rapids. We have had a number of Presbyterian churches who are closed or are closing, who get to a point that they're no longer viable in doing church the way that they have been for years past. So that there'll be, kind of a pretty significant sort of collapse in the way churches normally have operated. Then she says there'll be a rise also of these emergent forms of church, places that are doing things very differently, right? But that of that first group, there will be some churches that successfully navigate and are able to bridge that shift. And so instead of having, a dozen churches that kind of operated off of the old model, you might end up with two of them that successfully are able to navigate and embrace the new realities in enough of a way that you'd still look at them and you'd say, oh yeah, I know what that is. That's like the church-ish from my youth, but are doing enough things that are different that they're able to survive and thrive in kind of this changing move. Now, my hope is that First Pres will be one of those churches. And I think we have in our congregation enough willingness, and especially I've seen this past year, to try something new, to do something different, to think about things in a new way. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of work and a lot of challenges ahead of us. So let me just, and I'm gonna run out of time here. Let me just talk a little bit about a few of the things that I see, and this list is by no means comprehensive, but might give us a little bit of a sense of some of the things. And I'll key them to some of the differences that in our societal mix that I see. And things that we need to attend to. One, a deeper cultural diversity, and more diversity in general. I think one of the things that we need to think about and be about as a church is being very attentive to, and I'm not saying throw out our current worship style or anything like that, but be attentive to the ways in which that is no longer the primary worship vocabulary or the only worship vocabulary out there. And so be able to incorporate things like being able to use different, sorry, now we've got the organ going behind me, being able to use different languages and having portions of our worship in a language that's accommodating to those of our members who are coming out of Togo and Cameroon, and then that way making them feel more welcome, and being able to fully participate in their own language. It also might mean making sure we're attentive to not using or to explaining ourselves why we're doing things or what this means, because people are not coming into our congregation with those meanings already familiar to them. What does it mean to do a confession? Well, I don't know. That sort of sounds like something you hear on Law and Order. We can't assume a shared vocabulary and a shared culture. So we have to be attentive to both stretching ourselves and our spaces to accommodate other pieces that other cultural backgrounds can bring to us to enrich our worship, and also being able to and willing to explain ourselves and our worship vocabulary to others. So that's one thing that I think we need to be very attentive to as we head into the future. I already sort of mentioned and hit upon, kind of the stretch in lifespan. And really, I think spending time making sure that we are thinking about and incorporating the breadth of life experiences we have at First Presbyterian. I think we've got the potential to have some fabulous intergenerational connections to be made, and just connections across different parts of the lifespan of people, in ways that could be really wonderful, but we need to be very attentive to that, and we need to kind of grow into that. It's out there as potential for us, but I don't think we're maximizing it at all. And I think some of that is actually, we talk, well, I'll just go right into the next one. I talked about travel and relocation and people being in and out of communities. I think there's a way in which, younger persons with families who, again, no longer have kind of the family support system around them necessarily in the community that they've just moved into, being that for each other and being willing to welcome and to incorporate and to support from the get-go, it would be a wonderful opportunity that we have here at the church. Alongside that, being willing to engage and listen to people really quite early on. Now, I'm going to say a little something here, and you'll probably laugh a little bit, maybe, because I think our model in churches has often been, well, you come and you visit us for a while, and then you join, and then after we've checked you out for 4 or 5 years, then we'll let you, we'll let you do something in the church, like hang something on the wall. And then, maybe after a few more years, if you haven't caused any trouble on working on a committee, then we might elect you to session. Well, if you're talking about people who are moving in and out in a much more fluid way, they will never get to the point where they've been here for 5 years, so now they can serve and do something. Instead, we need to be willing to both reach out and engage and ask them how they would like to participate, and also ask them to be in leadership, not just like, okay, we need another body to be an usher. We need another body to serve in fellowship. But instead say, be equally willing to say, we need leadership in our church, and your voice matters to us as a newer member. Come share what your experience, what your knowledge, what you have to bring to the life of our church. So I think those kinds of things, those are both, very good potential for opportunities, and but also a challenge for us to really kind of shift our thinking, I think, in a way. And then, so again, I'm looking here and I'm thinking to myself, I've probably gone way over, as I usually do when I start talking. Then I'm just gonna skip over and hit right to the big one, which is the rise of the computer and internet. After this year of pandemic, I think maybe not we at First Presbyterian, but churches in general were slowly, as we do in the life of the church, making progress to a more hybrid church, a broader cast out into virtual and online spaces. And we were doing it very, very slowly and incrementally. And then the pandemic caused us to do probably what it would have taken us 10 years to do, right? And we had to do it in like 2 weeks and figure that out. And I don't think that there's any going back now. And I think churches that do say, oh, okay, we're done with that now, are the ones that are sealing their fate to no longer be in existence 10, 20 years from now. I think it's essential that we be able to provide places of connection and resourcing for people who may never set foot in our church, but may find spiritual help and direction from pieces we put out online, like an insight class or a worship service, or an educational offering. I think, talking now to some of, I always forget, it's Gen Z, which comes after the millennials, to some Gen Z, they don't really, there's not a denomination they're looking for, and when they go church shopping, they don't actually go to church. They check it out. They check out the website. They check out the online service. They check, it's all out there. And then the decision is made to come in. So I think the big challenge for us is going to be, and especially again at First Presbyterian, where we have a variety of people with a variety of needs and a variety of comfort in online spaces. I think we need to hold up this in-person gathering experience. That's the other thing the pandemic has taught us, is how precious that is. But I don't think that we can ever ignore this other piece too, because we've seen the potential for benefits, for things like this, for being able to have outside speakers and insight and such come in and share with us, to be able to remain connected with members who are traveling, or families who have a busy weekend, and and there will be shifts, because, I'm actually, and I can't really speak too much about this because I just signed up for a conference on how to help navigate this transition to be a hybrid church. How to welcome people online, how to follow up with people online, how to engage with people online, all the while you're doing it in person too. And how to make sure that you don't end up with two separate communities, but that you can integrate them into one community. That, I think, is going to be what our church will have to work through over the coming months and years, as we try to move forward. And I guess, okay, so and then that does bring up one other thing, that as I'm surrounded by this beautiful building is one of the other pieces that I've just been seeing in churches that are successful and vibrant, is that they have been using their building spaces. Not only are they working online, but they've also used the reality that gone are the days of the financed empty space, if that makes any sense to you. And this might be a little controversial, but gone are the days of the financed empty space, that the sanctuaries are used on a Sunday, and the Sunday only, and the Sunday school classes are only on Sundays, and we have some. Instead, the churches that seem to be doing the best job at making some of these transitions are also ones who are opening up places to the community to be used as a resource for the community. So they're seen as valuable, not only in a spiritual sense as the heart of the community, but also just in the ways in which they're meeting the community's needs through access to their building spaces. So I think that's going to be another piece for us. And we're already Lynn County food pantries are down in our basement. We've had in the past Family Promise, we've had Young Parents Network, those kinds of things, and figuring out creative ways to keep this building used and afloat, and having people coming in to our space. Because again, we're entering in a season, I think, where more often than not, it is not on people's radar to necessarily connect with the church family. And so the more in which we can engage with the needs of the community, and show people that there's something to this faith thing, that it makes a difference. It makes a difference in our lives and the life of our community, that it can make a difference in their life. That's the message that we need to embody and live out. And we have a fabulous building in which to do that. So I'm assuming that all of this is now gone over the time, and I am sitting here ready to take your questions on the Zoom call. So thanks so much for all your time and attention this morning, and I look forward to everything that First Pres will be looking at in the coming years. So thanks so much, and have a great morning.